Thank you for joining me today. We are in the Middle Ages, and we want to focus today on women. But the women that we are going to be talking about are the women who belong to the upper class, the nobility. And that means we are going to be talking about the women who are born and live in the castle. Now, when we say castle, we are not going to be talking about women in the early Middle Ages, where when the castles were very primitive, made out of wood, and they were not very easy to defend. The castle that we are talking about is the castle built in the High Middle Ages, and that is the very defensive stone castle that was usually built after the 11th century, 12th century, and it was surrounded by a moat, and it has usually only one entrance, because only one entrance was easy to defend the castle than if they had many openings. So we are going to follow one woman since she was born until the moment that she became the lady of the castle. So the little baby is born, usually helped in her birth by a midwife, and once the baby was born, she would spend her first days, months, years surrounded by her family. If she had older siblings, she would be with her siblings, playing with the other children in the nursery, and she would be growing up until she was maybe 5 to 7. In the Middle Ages, nothing is static. So everything was different from one place to another, or from the early Middle Ages to late Middle Ages. So what we are doing now is we are generalizing. So when the girl was about 6 or 7, she was supposed to start her training to become a lady herself. And in order to do that, she could not stay in her home with her parents. So what happened was she was sent from her home to another castle, where another lady would be helping her to become a lady. So just imagine you are 7 years old, a little girl, and your mom would come and say, it's time for you to leave us and to go and live in another place. So the little girl went to her new place, and she would live with another lady, and she officially at that point would become a lady in waiting. So she's being trained to become a lady. So she would spend her time either playing with younger children, or learning to read, or sometimes having fun with the knights, the young men who live in the castle. And so she would, but basically her duty is to learn how to be a lady. So she would be, for instance, learning how to weave, spinning. She would be learning how to write properly. And then once she has learned how to be a lady, then her parents will remind her that it's time for her to get married. And there will be another young man waiting for her to grow up. Now, I say another young man. That is not quite true, because when she was born, her father already chose someone to marry her. And that someone is a young man who, at the time of her birth, may be 18, 20. He's already a knight, and he will be patiently waiting for her to grow up to be married. So the marriage then is going to happen, and remember that after the time of Charlemagne, in the 9th century, marriage has become a religious affair. And the marriage festivities are going to end when the priest, with his and her parents, if they are alive, will take them to bed. And they will place them in bed. The priest will bless their union, and then everybody will leave and leave them to fulfill their marriage. So they leave and say, okay, now you do it. And so they become husband and wife, and at that point they go to his castle, and she will then start her life as the lady of the castle. And as the lady of the castle, she is responsible for everything that happens in the castle. She's responsible for the entire household. She's responsible for teaching what she was taught when she was a lady in waiting. She is going to be in charge of everything that goes on, and at the same time, she has to behave fully as a lady. We have writings from the Middle Ages in which the behavior of women is discussed, and she has to know how to speak. You cannot speak too much, but you cannot speak too little. You have to know when and how to speak. You have to be friendly, but not too friendly, especially with young men. So you have to always be happy, but not too happy. You have to smile, but not too much. You should always walk in the right way. You have to walk erect, but you have to always be pleasant. You should not be running around. You should always be showing signs of modesty, and that means don't look at people in the eyes. Look down, and that's how a good lady will behave. So, you are a young lady, the lady of the castle, you have all your duties, and at some point, your husband is going to come to you and say, darling, it's time for me to go and fight for my lord. So I have to go on campaign. And you will stay in charge of everything, in charge of the castle. And she is trained to do that, so she will do it. And so off he goes, and she will stay in the castle, taking care of everything without her husband. But I want you to see carefully what is here in this picture, because she is having babies, having a baby. She is having her ladies in waiting, but she's also surrounded by young men who are in the castle, being sure that the castle is safe. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but she now is even in charge of the defense of the castle. So if somebody attacks the castle, she is responsible for defending. And so there are many pictures of women who are actually participating in the defense of the castle. But let's go back to this young, maybe beautiful woman who has stayed in this castle surrounded by people without her husband. And there are people that, especially young men, that are looking at her, that are watching all her activities, and who may be falling in love with her. And her husband knows that. So her husband, before he leaves, especially if he's going to be away for a long time, wants to be sure that she is not going to be playing around with all those young, handsome men who are much younger than he is. So he decides to do something about it. And one of the possibilities is what we know as chastity belts. Now, there are some people who say, oh no, the chastity belts were not used that much. Well, I can tell you, in the museums in Europe, there are so many different chastity belts of all sizes, all shapes. These are only a few of them. And if you can see, this is a very small opening here. Look at this one. This looks like a baby diaper. And look at the opening. It's very small. So you can imagine that when a lady was placed in a chastity belt, all your basic natural necessities were done through that chastity belt. So that was a possibility for infections, for smelling. So it was not the best thing in the world for these young women. But story goes that these young women sometimes were smart enough, and as soon as the husband left, especially if they had eyes on a young knight around her, they would maybe call the village blacksmith and would convince him to open the lock, and then she would enjoy the rest of her life. And this is the last thing I will tell you about the life of women in the Middle Ages. So this is the end of this lecture, and I would like for you now just to think about how your life would be if you were a young woman of the nobility, or how would life would be if you were a young man of the nobility who went off on campaign and left your young wife in the castle by herself, surrounded by those young men.